Hi everybody, and welcome to the 13th of 14 Nights of Storytelling. My name is Julie Hartley and I'm one of the directors of Centauri Summer Arts Camp, Centauri Arts Retreat, the Arts Academy in Toronto, and a new business that we are now setting up, which is an online school for writers. Thank you for joining us tonight, and the story that I'm going to be telling you tonight is called Snowdrop. It's actually a traditional folk story that inspired Shakespeare, and I think as I tell the story, if you're familiar with Shakespeare, you will probably be able to tell at least one play that it very obviously influenced, and possibly more than one. There's also many strands of traditional folk stories within this one folk tale, and you'll probably be able to spot those as you go along. So I'm going to invite everybody to find a comfortable space for themselves, grab yourself a snack or a favorite drink, and then when you're ready to go, press start again and get ready to listen to this story. You're probably listening alongside other people, so as I always say every night, don't forget that one of the things that makes storytelling so special is it does create a link between people, as we all imagine the same things at the same time and take the same journey together. And people have been telling stories and listening to stories together for thousands of years. And without further ado, I would like to start. So please enjoy the story today. And today's story is called Snowdrop. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there was a queen who ruled a vast land. And this queen had one daughter called Snowdrop. And she was so besotted with her daughter, she loved her so deeply, loved her so much, that this queen forgot her responsibilities to her land. And as time went on, she just withdrew and thought only about her daughter. And that is why, when an evil king from another land came to usurp hers, she was unable to put up a defense. And before long, she found herself banished, and her daughter Snowdrop as no more than a slave of a new and evil king who took over the land that had once been so good and so filled with happiness. And this king was evil. This king held everybody under his thumb, and before long there were heavy taxes and everyone was struggling to live. And Snowdrop was nothing but a slave in the home where once she'd been a princess. And she dealt day after day with the consequences of her evil, of the evil king's rule. And Snowdrop grew, remembering very little of what it was like to be a princess. And sometimes people across the kingdom would think to themselves that there had been a time before when life had been brighter and happier. Now this evil king, he had a son, and the son's name was Will. And Will was good. He was not like his father at all. And as time went by, Will and Snowdrop became playmates. And before long, as they grew towards adulthood, they became more than that. Will and Snowdrop began to fall in love. Now this king was as shrewd as he was evil, and he started to realize two things simultaneously. The first was that his son was spending way too much time with this slave girl who should be working in the kitchens. And secondly, he started to hear rumors that across the land people were talking about how they would much rather Snowdrop was queen, because she would be good as her mother was before her, and they would be freed from the heavy yoke they lived under now that this king controlled the land. And this made the king furious, and he decided that he had been mistaken to keep Snowdrop as his servant, and that he should have had her banished and destroyed along with her mother. And so he spoke to some of his trusted servants, and he told them that they had to take Snowdrop the next day deep into the forest, and they should kill her and bury her body. Well, Snowdrop heard rumours of this, rumours that were meant to reach her ear because people did not want bad things to happen to her. and she had time to escape, but not time to warn Will. So she gathered a few possessions into a bag, and she crept from the palace, and she ran deep into the heart of the forest to save her life. And all the next day she ran, until she was hungry and tired and feeling all alone in the world. And when she was feeling so despondent and so exhausted she could continue no longer, Snowdrop came to a cave. There was nobody in the cave, so she opened the door and went inside. And she saw that the cave was filled with all manner of treasures. Wow, she thought, I have stumbled across a bandit's lair. These are bandits here, for sure. This is treasure that once belonged to rich people all across our land. And she was just about to escape, to try to get out of there before the bandits should come home and find her in their cave, when she noticed a table laid with food. And she was so hungry at this time, and she thought surely they wouldn't notice if just a little bit of their food was taken. And she ate quickly, but not quickly enough. Before she had downed her mouthful, the door of the cave opened, and the bandits started to return. Swiftly, without thinking about it, Snowdrop dropped to her knees and sank underneath the table to hide. Well, the bandits came in, they threw their latest treasure hoard on the ground, and they surrounded the table, about to begin eating, when one of them noticed that some of the food had already been eaten. "Who is it has been stealing our food?" they asked each other. "Well, we passed nobody in the forest, so whoever is stealing our food is still here." And with that, they lifted the tablecloth and saw underneath it Snowdrop cowering for her life. "Please don't hurt me," said Snowdrop. "I was just hungry, that was all. I was hungry and I had nothing else to eat." Now the thing with these bandits is they were not bandits or robbers by choice. They were people who had fallen on hard times because of the cruel rule of the new king, whose families had nothing left to eat, and who had fallen foul of the king's wicked rules, and they had had to flee for their lives to the forest. So when they saw Snowdrop under the table and they realized who she was, they instantly took pity on her. They helped her out from under the table, and they asked her if she would like to join them, to live with them as a fellow bandit, to rob from the rich and give to the poor as they did. "A lot of the time we just get food and treasure," one of the younger bandits said, "but sometimes we come across something magical. Look at this." And he held out to show her a pair of red shoes. "They're just shoes," said Snowdrop. "Oh no," the bandit said. "These are magical shoes, trust us, for whoever wears them must dance, and they will continue dancing to the edges of the kingdom for the rest of their days." "Well," said Snowdrop, "you surely do have a very special bandit's hoard here, and I will join you because I have no alternative, and I'll live with you and help you to do what you do, to rob from the rich and give to the poor." And that was the beginning of Snowdrop's new life. Meanwhile, in the palace, Will was stricken with sorrow and grief to realize that Snowdrop was gone. And rumors were that she'd been taken out into the forest and killed, though he really did not want to believe that. And every day he would leave the palace and go wandering in the trees near to the palace to try to just catch a glimpse of Snowdrop. And when he never did, he found a glade not too far from the palace walls. The glade was filled with apple and pear trees, and every day he would go there and write poetry about Snowdrop and how much he loved her. And he would hang the poems from the trees, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she might be alive, and one day she would see them. Well, one day, Will came to the glade as usual to hang poems from the trees, and there, strangest of strange sights, he saw a bandit standing smiling at him. And it took him only a moment to realize that this stranger in bandit's clothes was none other than Snowdrop herself. He rushed to her, and the two of them embraced, so happy to be back with one another. "I'm so delighted to see you," Snowdrop said. "But look, you can't destroy my reputation as a fierce bandit by hanging love poems from trees." And she laughed at Will. "How about this? You promise to stop writing love poetry, and I will meet you here every day, and we can spend time together." Will gladly agreed, and that day and the day after and the day after that, he left the palace eagerly as soon as he was able, and he wandered into the forest to meet with Snowdrop, and they would sit under the trees sharing dreams for a future that they one day hoped to spend together. But the king started to notice that his son would disappear without any reason day after day, and he had him followed, and before long realized with fury that Snowdrop was not fled the kingdom and had not been killed, but was actually living very close by in a cave of bandits. "She must die," he told himself, "for my kingdom will never be safe while she is alive. There are always those who would rather see her rule this land, and my son is mine. He must not be allowed to fall for her." And so the next day, the king put on a disguise. He disguised himself as an old peddler woman, put some trinkets in a basket, and walked through the forest to the cave where the bandits were living. And he noticed straight away that the bandits were gone for the day, and he knocked on the door of the cave. Well, at that time Snowdrop was alone inside, and she was very surprised to hear a knock. She opened the door, and there on the other side of the door stood an old peddler woman. She felt immediately sorry for the old woman, seeing her dressed there in rags. She said, "What do you have for sale? I will surely spend some of our treasure to buy something from you and make your life a little easier." And the king reached forward the basket of treasures, and Snowdrop saw a beautiful shining necklace inside. She picked it out of the basket. "Let me help you try that on, dear," said the old peddler woman, and she put the necklace over Snowdrop's head and immediately drew it tight and tighter still until Snowdrop was choking for her life and falling to her knees, unable to breathe, and the king laughed and started to pull even tighter. But then, just at the moment where he thought he might strangle Snowdrop to death, which was his whole intention, he heard tromping through the trees towards the cave, and he let loose the necklace and ran for his life. And it was the robbers coming back to the cave, and they immediately saw what had happened, rushed forwards, released Snowdrop's neck from the necklace, and nursed her back to life again. As she was gathering her breath and breathing deeply and fingering her neck, which was now filled with a line of bruises, they said to her, "You must be more careful, for clearly the king wants to see you dead and will stop at nothing to kill you. Do not answer the door next time someone knocks. You must stay safe." Well, the king thought he might have been successful, that he might have killed Snowdrop, but the next day his son went out to the grove as usual, was gone all day, and came back as he always did with a smile on his face, and the king stamped his legs in fury. "I did not succeed," he told himself. "I must go again, try once again every art of trickery to kill this girl and end this threat to my kingdom." So the next day, the king dressed himself in the costume of a flower seller. He filled a basket full of flowers, and he went through the trees again to the robber's cave, where he knocked upon the door. Well, the robbers had gone about their business, and again Snowdrop was on her own, but she remembered what all the bandits had told her about being cautious and not opening the door of the cave to anybody. So while the knocking continued, she just stood and listened to it. And she listened until the person had stopped knocking and there had been footsteps leading away from the cave. And only then did she cautiously open the door. And on the threshold was a bunch of the most beautiful flowers she had ever seen. And it came to her in that moment that maybe it was not anybody evil who was giving her these flowers. Maybe it had been Will, and he had discovered where she was living. "Oh, Will, these flowers are beautiful," she told herself, and she swept them up in an embrace, and only as she did so realized that a very strange smell was coming from the flowers, a deadly, poisonous smell. And she spun around and she tossed the flowers into the fire. And as she did so, an evil stench filled the cave, and she choked and rushed outside and fell to her knees, struggling to breathe yet again. And in that moment, the robbers came home, and the bandits looked at Snowdrop on her knees. "You must be more careful," they said, as once again they nursed her back to health. And the king went back to the palace, hoping that this time Snowdrop was dead. And he watched his son go out the next day to the grove, hoping that he would be back within moments, despondent because his true love had not been there to meet him. But the opposite happened. Will was gone all day and came back again with a dreamy smile on his face. And the king stomped his feet in rage. "I have failed yet again," he said, "but I will not fail a third time." And that night he went out to the grove where he knew Will and Snowdrop met each other every day, and he took with him a basket of poisoned apples, enchanted poisoned apples. And he took each of the apples and he placed them underneath the apple trees throughout the grove. And then he went back to the palace and fashioned a reason that would keep Will at home that day, for he certainly had no intention of harming his son. So as usual, Snowdrop left the bandits' cave and went to the grove to meet with Will. He was a little late that day, and she wandered around the trees looking for something to occupy herself, missing his love poetry for once, and thinking about the happy days they'd spent together under the apple trees. And so it was that she looked down, and her gaze settled on a beautiful rosy red apple at her feet. "I am a little hungry," she told herself, and she picked up the beautiful apple, shone it on her skirt, and bit into it. Hours later, when the bandits realized that Snowdrop had not returned to the cave, they went out in search of her. They searched high and low, until, extremely worried for her safety, they came upon the grove where she'd been meeting with Will every day, and there they found her, collapsed in a swoon far deeper than sleep, underneath one of the trees. They were distraught beyond compare, knowing that Snowdrop was under an enchantment so powerful they had no way to break it. "She is not dead, but she is so close to death," one of them said, "and she will hover there for as long as it takes for her to wake, and we know not how to do it." So they had a glass case fashioned, and they placed the body of Snowdrop inside, and one of them harnessed a wild horse, and they attached the glass case on the back of a cart to the wild horse, and let the wild horse leave with it, so that it would wander throughout the kingdom by day and by night, through weeks and months and years, until perhaps somebody with the power to break the enchantment might see the glass coffin, look inside, and take pity on Snowdrop. "We cannot help you," the bandits said as they watched the wild horse canter away pulling the glass coffin. "We can do nothing to save you, but perhaps something or someone else will." And it was sad days that followed for the bandits in their cave, and sadder still for Will, for when he was able to return to the grove, Snowdrop did not come again, and as days lengthened into weeks, he started to worry if perhaps he'd seen his true love for the final time. And as Will grew sadder and sadder, there were rumors began circulating around the kingdom. People spoke of the strangest sight, a sight as magical as it was strange, a wild horse pulling a glass coffin, and inside the glass coffin, somebody that looked very much like the old queen that everybody remembered from happier times. A young girl, too young to be the queen, lost in a sleep so deep that no one knew how to break the enchantment. Until soon everybody in the kingdom knew about this story, although nobody claimed to have seen it in truth, and nobody could say whether it was just a story or not. But there are few things that are only stories. And soon it was only Will that had not heard about this glass coffin being pulled behind a wild horse. And while life went on as usual, difficult and painful for everyone since the new king's rule, only Will had not heard about the glass coffin, for he stayed in his room, gazing down over the palace grounds and over the high wall towards the grove where he'd spent the only happy times of his life. And days stretched to weeks, stretched to months, until at last the inevitable happened. It just so happened that the glass coffin pulled by the wild horse appeared outside the palace walls. This was not a surprise really, for it had been just about everywhere in the kingdom by then. And the palace gates were open at the time, and so the horse came in to nibble at the grass inside, pulling behind it the glass coffin, and in it the body of Snowdrop. And the king was busy, and the prince was inside in his room. So one by one, everybody who worked and lived around the palace began to gather in the palace gardens, making an enormous crowd on all sides of the glass coffin. And they peered into it, and one by one realized that the person inside it, that it was Snowdrop, and that grown now, she'd grown so much since they last saw her, and grown the way she was, she looked so much like the good and true and honest queen they all remembered. And at last the crowds were so big that Will, sitting morosely in his room, caught sight of them through the window, and he jumped up and he went downstairs to see what was amiss, and he pushed through the crowds until he too was startled to see that the person in this glass coffin was none other than Snowdrop, the girl he had loved his whole life. And he stood beside the glass, gazing in, thinking he was seeing her dead body, and filled with more grief than he'd thought was possible. Tears ran down his cheeks, and nobody could really think of anything to say to calm the prince. And now it was the king's turn to hear the commotion outside on the palace lawns. And he went outside and he also pushed his way through the crowds until he also came face to face with Snowdrop, the one person he had hoped never to see again. And once again he was taken up by an enormous fury, and he stomped his foot in rage, and as he did so he had the urge to sling things, and so, unable to control it, he pushed past his son and gave a shove to the glass coffin, which fell off the cart to the ground and shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. And as it did so, the little shard of enchanted apple that had been caught inside Snowdrop's mouth fell to the earth. And as it did so, the enchantment was broken, and she opened her eyes. "How like the dead queen she looks," somebody said. And Snowdrop rose to her feet and stood in front of Will, and they embraced. He'd never been so happy in his life as in that moment, to see the person he loved looking well and happy, despite looking so dead just a short while ago. And he held on to her hand and he said, "Tell us the story of what befell you." And Snowdrop immediately told the story of all the attempts on her life, and everyone turned and looked at the king. "Quickly, "Call the bandits from the cave, see if they can verify her tale," somebody said. And the bandits hurried to the palace courtyard to report that yes, indeed, everything Snowdrop said was true, that it was the king who had hounded her from into the forest. And somebody reported that yes, the king had wanted to have her killed, and somebody else said yes, the king had always hated Snowdrop. And everyone turned on the evil king. And at the same time, they all realized they'd had enough. "Something must be done," someone said. "We no longer want you as our ruler," said somebody else. And the king realized that now he would be fighting not for his kingdom, but for his life. And Snowdrop said, "It is surely the case that everyone is worse off with this king in power." And she told the stories that she'd heard one by one of her friends, the bandits, how they had been forced to flee for their lives because of the taxes and because of the awful laws that the king had put in place, how their families were starving and the families of everyone they knew, and therefore the bandits had turned to stealing from the rich and giving to the poor in order to help everyone make ends meet. "No one should have to do that," said Snowdrop. "What are we going to do with him?" someone else said. And one of the bandits stepped forward, and in his hands were a pair of red shoes. He knelt down and he placed them on the king's feet. "There," he said, "now our king must wander and dance and run across the kingdom for all eternity, and hopefully we will never see him again." And the dancing shoes began their enchantment and danced with the king out of the palace gardens, through the trees, and onward into the rest of the world, and he was never ever seen again. And Will and Snowdrop were married in great ceremony with a party to which the entire land was invited, and no one had ever witnessed a day of such happiness before. And the bandits were pardoned and returned to their families, and everyone's life was resumed in great joy. And it could be said that it was not just Will and Snowdrop that lived happy lives from that moment on. Sure they did, for they were deeply in love. But it also has to be said that the entire land lived happily ever after. And that is the story of Snowdrop. And it inspired As You Like It and countless other tales. Thank you all for listening, and the next tale will be 8:30 Eastern Standard Time tomorrow night. It will be the 14th and final tale, and I'll be telling it live on the Centauri YouTube channel. So you can find the link on Facebook, or just go to Centauri on YouTube, and you should be able to follow me live at 8:30. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.